And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It is Ball Up Top, a podcast by No Cap Space WBB. Andrew Hovner, happy to be with you and happy you are here with us. We did something different this time for Ball Up Top. Usually for those that watch, you know, it's some iteration of me, Greer, Tyler, or Shawnee. But instead, we decided to run the ISO because there's a lot of discussion happening in the world of the WNBA and WNBA labor. So we went out and got an expert on exactly how all this stuff works. The managing director at Secretariat and former executive director of the National Basketball Players Association, Tamika Tremalio, is joining us. Tamika, thank you so much for being on with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I guess for starters, for the people that are unaware of you and your background in all of this, could you give us a quick introduction just about how your path led to the NBPA, to Secretariat, and where you kind of stand now these days?
No, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to do that. So I was right here in Washington, D.C. as a managing partner of Deloitte. I actually retired in January of 2022 after serving in many roles in the business of sports, very much like you, Andrew. So beginning in 2009, was doing work with the NFLPA, then did work with the NBPA, then did work with the WNBPA. And when I retired, I had been working in sports for about 15 years. And so, of course, it was then time to sort of look at the CBA for the men. And so I retired and went to become the executive director of the NBPA. The other thing, though, just to note, was in 2020, I actually helped the women with the CBA in 2020. So I was very intimately familiar with the CBA. And so it really positioned me well to be able to do that with the men. And now I'm actually here at Secretariat and I'm running their global sports practice, which I love because it keeps me within the business of sports. So back to the things I love to do around investigations and litigations and construction delays and disputes. Again, still all on the sports side.
I'm curious what the balance is between having to kind of be somebody that can negotiate with the soft touch, but also sort of enjoy the fight, as you seem to do, right? When it comes to things like litigation, collective bargaining. I mean, those things are inherently, they're battles, and the hope at the end of the day in most of these negotiations is that you look at the other person like you would coming off the floor of the NBA or WNBA finals and say, hard fought battle, we're still cool. How much does that dynamic exist within this world of negotiation where you got to balance light touch and bulldogishness and make sure that not one doesn't overcome or supersede the other?
No question. There is an art of negotiation. There's no question. And it really is about sort of, both tides rising for everyone, right? And so that's really the focus. And I think even when we look at the WNBA and the WNBPA, it really is about this partnership and seeing this as being more transformational than transactional. I think that's really what's important. And at the end of the day, with any negotiation, there's going to be some give and take. And so it's about being able to do that and all sort of still come out on top, if you will.
That's the interesting thing about all this, because I feel like there is a general and societal concept. And I mean, we do it in sports media too, right? When we talk about the concept of something as simple as a trade, the idea has to be there's got to be a winner and there's got to be a loser. There's not really as much a discussion in the world right now about two sides can come to an agreement on something and both can benefit from it. It might not be in the same way, but there can be a way in which there are two winners. When you are negotiating on behalf of labor, how do you manage to impress that upon a ownership class that generally, and at least anecdotally in business, kind of tend to see the world in this in this manner of winners and losers, of I have to win, so you have to lose? Is there an art to being able to convince people who are that strictly about the numbers that there is wins on both ends, as long as there are concessions to be made on certain things?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that that's as much of a struggle as it appears to be, right? I do believe that the owners of the W teams are very much focused on how they can both win. I mean, it is a very different situation, I think. I think when people invest in the W, of course, everyone makes investments with the thought that they will eventually come out on top and, make their investments back and then some, right? There's no question. But that's a win for everyone. I think, too, that those individuals, particularly the owners of the W teams, they really do want it to be such that, everybody is winning. At the same time, they have to be very realistic about what the numbers are and what they're showing. And I think part of the issue or concerns that they're having is around transparency. So the women within the W want to understand the numbers. They want to understand why the numbers are where they are when you would clearly have the expectation that things have grown so much. Viewership is up to 140%. They have a $2.2 billion media deal. So there would be some expectation that would come over into how they're being compensated. And from where they sit, they aren't seeing that happen. And, it's not just, Andrew, about equity, it's about parity. And so making sure that they're being seen for what they're worth. And at the end of the day, there's a way to arrive at that where I think both parties could be really happy in this.
Is there a way when in your experience, whether it be within basketball or just in the general corporate world, when trust gets broken between two parties in a negotiation, is there a way to get that back? Or is there a fundamental change in how the negotiation occurs if one side doesn't trust the other when the stakes are as high as some of the things that, you've presided over, be it in sports or outside of it?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question, actually, because, I will say at Deloitte, one of the things that we did focus a lot on was around trust and trust in a business sense, because the reality is that is not a word, Andrew, that you would use in the corporate world. But the reality is we know that it matters, right? And so I remember taking this great course. And so I'm glad you actually asked this question, and it sort of defined what trust was. And we are numbers people, right? So at the end of the day, it's a very simple formula. They would always describe it as credibility plus reliability and a level of intimacy, right? And obviously you mean that in the business sense where you know something about them. They have children, kids are in college, whatever the case might be. And all of that over your own benefit, right? So where trust falls down is when they aren't credible, right? They aren't doing what they say they're going to be doing. And, if they tell you that 2 + 2 is 2, it's 4. 2 + 2 is 4. You would expect it to be 4, right? Are they reliable? Do they show up when they say they're going to show up? If I tell you I'm going to be there at 8:00, I'm going to be there at 8:00. You can rely on that. Do we have sort of that level of intimacy, that relationship that means that I can trust that you're going to do things? And then is it about the whole? Is it about the W as a whole, or is there more focus on the individual? And so what I want is going to far exceed what you want. That's when trust gets destroyed, right? That's It's very simple. And the reality is there has to be that level of trust to be able to negotiate in a way in which it's going to be a win-win for everyone. That's where you can.
And the reason that I bring that up, obviously there's been discussions, about Nafisa Collier and Kathy Engelbert and some of the dynamics at play here with the players and the league itself. And, going back over decades of history, right? There is an argument to be made, I think, that at various inflection points within the history of the WNBA and the history of women's basketball in general, there has been these places where the security and safety that is offered by something like the NCAA instead of the AIAW, right? The WNBA instead of the ABL. There is a secure floor that exists that allows you to have a degree of safety away from market forces maybe leading you towards something like insolvency, right? The thing now is, I feel like the players have such a massive leverage here that there seems to be, at least from my, perspective, there seems to be more of a security among the players, or at least a confidence that the floor will not bottom out if, something happens. If a work stoppage happens, the floor will not disappear on you. How much in your experience has women's sports changed over the last 25, 30 years, where in past iterations, we've had to see, safety and security, and in response, maybe a surrender of certain controls that other leagues might have. And watching that evolve into a place where, the control still exists, but the insecurity or the scarcity around interest of the product is not. I mean, how unique does that make this particular labor negotiation with respect to, say, the NBA and the NBPA when they're arguing, when they're at the table or going to the table again? And it just feels like a totally different ball game we're playing here in the W right now.
Yeah, and I think, Andrew, are you referring to sort of the concept around sustainability? Like, is it going to be continuing as a going concern? Is that your thought, and that maybe things have changed? Yes. So, I would think so. First of all, going back to the point I mentioned around trust, and I will also share with you that Andrea Howe was the person who sort of originated that formula. But in that, she also talked about, sort of who the parties are and what are the market dynamics that are at play, which is precisely what you're mentioning. And in this particular instance, there seems to be so much discussion around sustainability. The reality is, it is really clear that it's sustainable, or people who are incredibly brilliant who have invested in the W would not have invested in the W. We just saw 3 teams being sold for $250 million. So I don't know what sustainability looks like if that doesn't look like sustainability, right? And so I think that that's what we have to sort of move away from. So to continue to tell the women that it's about, making sure that this is sustainable and that we can keep doing this, et cetera. They understand that, right? Again, it's about shared performance. Like, they have some skin in the game, you have some skin in the game, but it has to be where both sides feel like they're winning. And I think it's an issue around the shared performance. It's an issue around, absolutely, this is a sustainable, and we would anticipate and expect that it will continue and that they will continue to do well and viewership will continue to go up. So I think that's where we have to look at where the market is going. And the market is showing that people want to watch women playing basketball.
Let me ask you this, because as someone with experience at Deloitte, I feel like the general popular sentiment around, the big four accounting firms, but also with, private equity and Wall Street in general, is kind of a concept on some level of risk aversion. Because the idea is, if you are a publicly traded company or you are just an equity owner within, a closed system like the NBA or WNBA, the mindset is, we could take the risk, but the short-term potential loss is more of a threat than a better long-term gain. So there is an incentive, it seems, to play it safe on certain levels, because upsetting the apple cart might represent a disruption that could affect a share price, or it could affect overhead, or could affect a bottom line, when the reality is you might be leaving money on the table in the long term if you aren't open to accepting the risk inherent with that. So is that something that is is that an accurate description of how people within this world sort of look at things, whether it be somebody working within one of the big four at a high level, or somebody working within a professional sports league, that the concept of risk is actually something that people look at in a much more short-term lens than a long-term lens, and can sometimes become a hindrance because you are worried about the short-term instability, even if it means surrendering the long-term gains.
Yeah. So excellent, excellent point. And for certain, people are always weighing that, right? And I think the people who invest in the owners who invest in the W, I think they are in it for the long run, right? They are in it with the expectation that we're going to have to make certain investments so that, in the long run, we will all do well. The challenge, however, is that who is actually assuming most of the risk right now, right? The risk has to be shared. And the challenge with what the perception is, and I'm going to say this, the perception is that the women are sharing more of the risk and they're giving all of their blood, sweat, and tears, right? So that's where that's coming from. And they aren't going to play forever, right? The owners, I recognize they may not be here forever, but they're likely going to be there longer, right? And over overall, when they're looking at it, the thought is that they will end up doing well in the long run. And the women are thinking about, yes, we are making sure that we're investing for future generations. And they have done that. There is no question that they've done that. I think both the men and the women are some of the most selfless professional athletes that exist in the world. There is no question of that. But I think there comes a time when they want that risk to be shared. And I believe that that's essentially what's happening here, is that they're asking, let's share the risk. We're not saying that there is none. We're willing to take some. You should be willing to take some.
And that actually leads perfectly into the next question I had about it, because you're right. Like the players appear to be asking to take on a greater degree of risk, because on the other side of that is also a greater perspective reward, right? And there's always been this kind of discussion about financials and where the league is at, and how much money is actually being made in here. And, I'm curious, when you look back at your experience, not only with the MBPA, but the WNBPA, how much of a split are we looking at in terms of how players and, the union reps and executive committee feel about the finances of it, and how much of it is rooted in a respect concept? Because I think that people sometimes look at, and I don't love this, because I think on some level it's coded and it's a little wonky and gauche, is like the idea of, oh, these women are emotional. And, Adam Silver kind of had a similar inference in his comments about, this became too personal. And it's like, no, if the player's concept is a lack of respect is what is affecting the actual business side of this, then both of those things do matter together. And I guess in your experience going back through working with that PA, how much do you feel like those two concepts worked in tandem with each other? The idea that the baseline amount of respect actually feeds into the business and vice versa, as opposed to being two separate concepts where when you're working and negotiating in business, you have to sort of look at everything from a very like inhuman kind of standpoint, a very robotic numbers, dollars, and driven cents standpoint.
Yeah. So, I love and appreciate what you have said around, sort of being able to separate business in a way that doesn't encompass respect, right? To some extent. But I think that, everyone knows that part of this is feeling respected, and somehow the respect equates to value and how the women feel valued. That's what a lot of this is about. And I think even Kathy has said that if they haven't done that, if there's a perception that this hasn't been done, then they need to do better. And I think she has acknowledged that that is in fact the case, because at the end of the day, that's what matters. That's the perception becomes the reality. So there's no question that that is it. I do think, however, that the women are able to distinguish on both sides, women and men are able to distinguish business from personal, but value inherently becomes personal, right?
Yeah.
Because the way in which we're valued is what we bring to the table and how we think we are, utilized and respected in society, and certainly in the game of basketball. And so I think that, it would be not only a mistake, but I think it's an impossibility to completely separate the two. And I think that's where the challenge is. The women are absolutely asking to be respected. They're asking to be treated as respected business entrepreneurial women that they are, right? They have grown up in an NIL era. We are in a very different time. We're not sitting here, a decade ago when women didn't know what they were worth, when they didn't know what they could do, in college and actually be, making money at that time. They absolutely know what they're worth. And so I think this is about treating them as sophisticated business women that they are, and making sure that that shows up in the way in which you're dealing with them. So if that's respect, then yes, I think that's absolutely what they're demanding.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up NIL too, because I think that the younger generation of players here bring a really interesting dynamic to this labor negotiation, because they've never lived in a world without a WNBA. They have never lived in a world where scarcity and the threat of scarcity has existed. And so to them, this, the utilization of leverage, A, is already something known to them because that's what they did in college with the advent of NIL. And while some people can, argue the good and the bad of unchecked leverage, the way we've seen at the college level lately, it has instilled in this first couple of years of players here, these young players, that leverage is a tool to be used and not something to threaten until you're being told be grateful for what you have. There is a not just an understanding of leverage, but a knowledge and a confidence in the leverage that seems to exist within that younger generation of players. And you look at it in past CBAs, where the use of leverage has gone and what it's done, right? I mean, I remember talking to players and union reps in 2020, and I asked them point blank, like, why didn't you go to the mat for rev share? Why didn't you go to the mat for salaries? And they said we wanted to focus on the stuff around, the fringes first, maternity care and housing and all of these other things that you can at least try to make it up in the aggregate, the lack of massively pushed salaries. But it feels like now that all of that stuff is in place, coupled with all of the numbers, you're ending up in a place where the leverage has never been greater, and you have a generation of players coming in that are more than willing and more than happy to exercise that leverage. When you were working with the PA in 2020, did you get the sense that there was sort of this, keep the leverage in the chamber for the perfect moment to use it, and in the meantime, fight these other fights that can almost build the foundation better? So when you want to have the pay and rev share discussion, which is going to be the battle and the war, you have all of this other stuff already taken care of and can fully exercise the leverage in the way that, you are supposed to when you're in a negotiation.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think one, from a leverage standpoint, we can all agree that without the women playing basketball, there is no WNBA, right? So, we can level set there. And I think everybody knows that. So from a leverage standpoint, absolutely, I think they get that. I also think that they recognize that there are other opportunities to play basketball, whether here in the United States or outside of the United States. And so that's also a very clear point to them. However, with that is the demand for them wanting to play in the W, right? It's sort of, you as a child, you grew up for boys to be in the NBA, for girls to be in the W. So it's like a sort of rite of passage, if you will. And I don't think that they want to let go of that. I think that they're very excited about the potential for that, but they do understand that they are the product, and they understand that it wouldn't go without them. They also understand that they have value in the fact that they are the best in the world at what they do. And so therefore, they want to make sure that in some way it's being qualified that way when you look at it from a monetary standpoint. And that's really what they feel like they aren't seeing. And I think it's really important that they start to see that. And I will also just say that, yes, we focused in 2020 on maternity benefits and, slight changes to travel, et cetera, but they did get revenue share, right? I think what happened is that it didn't show up in the way in which they had anticipated or hoped that it would, because there were so many expenses that were being taken off the top that they weren't getting to the point where they actually were able to share in revenue. That's the challenge, but not because they feared, asking for it or didn't want to do it. It's just they did it. They put it in there. It just didn't show up in the way in which they would have hoped it would have shown up, because there's so many investments made to get them to where they are.
Yeah, could you actually, for our audience, because I think a lot of people don't understand the intricacies of that rev share component, could you explain for those listening what that rev share actually is, right? Like how much gets taken off the top, and how much when people say 9% of the rev share goes to players, there's all of these other things that get skimmed. So that percentage ends up becoming a little bit smaller now.
Yes. And so the reality is, however, in the actual CBA, the rev share is 50-50. So it sounds really good on its face, right? That's the, very similar to men. That's the expectation. In reality, there are so many expenses that have been agreed upon that come off the top before you get to the 50-50. And then in addition, even for the women, the 50% is then divided in half, where 25% of that goes to the players individually, and then 25% of that goes to the marketing piece that then is paid to select players. So that's where they're getting down to the 9 and 10%. That's not what the women had hoped for, obviously, and arriving at that at the very beginning. But the reality is, because when you're setting up for the media deals, et cetera, there's additional money that's being spent, and that's coming off the top before you get down to what is actually being paid to the women. So it's not that they didn't think about it from a business standpoint or were reluctant to ask for it. It's just that what we did not likely appreciate is how much from an expense standpoint would come off the top. For the men, there's basketball related income, and there are months of negotiation over what's considered basketball related income. The NBA comes up with the amount, the NBPA comes up with the amount, they argue about it, they come to an amount, and then they distribute it. That doesn't happen in the W, right?
Mhm.
Part of the challenge too. There's an ability to audit, but it doesn't happen. And that's part of the challenge.
How unique of a challenge is it when you have the NBA that owns, a non-insignificant portion of the WNBA as an entity, right? So you have NBA, WNBA owners that, are joint owners that have a say within that 40%. But to my understanding, I mean, there's governors in the NBA that have no affiliation to the W whatsoever that have the ability to have an impact on the decisions that are made. When you were advising on this, I mean, how much does that intricacy make it unique relative to other leagues and how they handle their negotiations with a singular league entity?
Well, I still think that the owners have the majority of say in how the owners of the W, right? Directly. I think they still have a significant portion of this. But, yes, the NBA has supported the W for a really long time. So they offered their opinions and suggestions. But I don't believe that even if you went to the owners in the NBA, that they would want the best for the women as well. I think the goal is, I think it's very complementary. They're both thinking in the same way. I think the outcome is really where the challenge is. And really, I think the women have been underestimated. And,
Mhm.
they are incredibly sophisticated, and they are business women who have been negotiating from a very young age, and they have seen where that has paid off. And for them to get to this point in their lives where it's not paying off, I think that's very challenging.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting because I think that the broader discussion that is had, and to be quite candid, this is something that I've felt before, is that logic in business would dictate, right, that if you are the NBA, the best case scenario for you as a league that holds so much uh percentage of ownership over the W is that making it as high profit and low overhead as humanly possible is the best way to extract capital for you as a part owner here. um do you think that that is, I don't want to say at the heart of what we're debating over within this labor fight, but what the broader discussion is about how we assess labor's value, but also how those in the capital class assess labor's value? Because the idea, on its face feels like one that is very accounting centric, right? If you keep costs low and you keep profits high, that's the best case for everybody. But at what point does that mindset have to become a little bit more fluid in order to avoid what appears to be happening here, which feels like, an imminency in a potential work stoppage? I mean, do you feel like there is some of that mindset inherent in here where it's just business brain, and business brain is good for business, but when you got to deal with people, business brain can sometimes be a problem if you don't realize you're doing things with a little too much business brain.
Yeah, and actually, Andrew, it's so funny because we started this by talking about trust. And to your point, when I talked about self-interest, exceeding credibility, reliability, and intimacy. That's what's happening here, right? Because there is a lot of self-interest in, what is in it for me, right? And certainly I appreciate that it is happening on both sides, right? But the reality is I think it really is, and it has to be that the owners think about the future of the W and how can we make this successful for the women who are playing the game, and then to attract other generations to want to play in the W. It would break my heart when I was at places and people would say they're exceptional basketball players, but they don't want to play in the W. They want to go overseas and play, or they want to play for Unrivaled or do something else because they weren't going to make money doing that. And for many of these women, they're graduating with, degrees, and they can go on and do other things and make a lot more money than they'd won in the W. And that becomes critically important. And so I think that when they're talking about the long term, they got to think about the next generations and how they're going to attract that next generation of players.
So a couple more for you, and I appreciate your generosity and your time and kind of being willing to get into the weeds with me on some of this stuff. As I'm sure you can tell, I am an absolute geek for this type of thing. So this is the best interview I've gotten. When you look at the unrivaled component of this, it's a 3-on-3 league that operates out of a singular hub, and they added a second in Philadelphia. But on its face, it's a totally different league conceptually than what the WNBA is. And as much as I would love personally to see a full divestment away, because I think that's the way women's basketball at the professional level is able to unlock its growth to its full potential, there is this legitimate question of, if we go into a work stoppage, does Unrivaled even have any interest in creating a 5-on-5 to be an overflow league, or does this become a 3-on-3 league still? And we're looking at, a couple of the other nascent leagues that do 5-on-5, like Exalt and Upshot, that are kind of on the way up and can be overflow places for that. There are a lot of other places for players to go. But I guess my curiosity is, that aspect has been there before. Why does this feel different in terms of the leverage of what another league can offer when it comes to players feeling like, I can walk away from the table here and potentially be a lot safer than I was 5 years ago from a play perspective?
Yeah, really excellent point. And you are correct. I think there are a lot of challenges, however, with that, partly because, this is taking place during the time when the women are really getting a break, right? And so many of them are off during that time period. Currently, it's not set up from a structural perspective to, have the audiences as large as a W game, et cetera. But you are right that it is, for some, a absolute clear backup plan, right? And that's attractive. And by the way, Andrew, it's a backup plan that shares in performance, right? If they do well, the women do well. The players have equity in the league. That's what it's all about now, right? It is that simple. Like, if we fail together. If we win together. And I think that Nikki Lawler, the commissioner, has made a point to have the players feel like they're in it with them. And I think that's what we need. That's what they need. That's what, drives them. And we have very sophisticated business owners, for the WNBA, and they get it too. And I think a lot of them do believe that there's, shared performance, but it's not showing up in that way. And so really it's about being more creative with the solutions and thinking about those things like Unrivaled and the other things that are happening throughout the world that the women can do, and think about, like, how can we sort of transform this? We can't look at this the same way and as league and labor, and let's just figure out the CBA. I mean, I've said this before, Andrew, so I'll just repeat it here. They probably need to just rip it up and start all over again, because times are very different. And you've got to look at how you both can be successful. And I think that's what's being missed here. When you keep starting to build upon something that didn't really work that well, you're just adding on more junk. You're just right. And so to some extent, I think they've got to sort of just think about this from a totally different perspective. And that is
Is that
hard to do.
possible? Like, can you theoretically, if you're the WNBA and WNBPA, assuming everybody wants to do this, I would imagine the WNBA doesn't as an entity because this feels like it's been very good for them from a business perspective, at least over the last 2-3 years. Can you really rip it up and start over? If that was really the interest of everybody, could you start over at ground zero with the CBA and just make something completely new?
Andrew, I'm a big proponent on reimagining the possible. And I do believe it's possible. And I think they all have to reimagine that. There are some things that are very good within the CBA as it exists. There are some things that are really bad. And you have to think about how can we take some of the good, leave some of the bad on both sides. I think it's a very different time period than when the W started, at a time when you couldn't play basketball professionally in the US. But I read Don Staley's book recently, and I remembered like, oh my gosh, there was a time when the W wasn't here. He was talking about sort of going to the, and I go, oh my gosh, that was in my lifetime actually. But we started really paying attention to it. It's always been the W and the NBA, but that's not the case. That's not the world that the women who are playing came from. And so they've come from a world of NIL, and people are making money, and social media and influencers and all of these other things. And we've got to change that so that it reflects that.
So last question for you, and this is a bit of a big one and a loaded one. I look at this negotiation as something that is much larger than basketball. I mean, this feels like, if played out to its logical conclusion, right? If we end up getting in a theoretical world, a work stoppage, Unrivaled goes to 5-on-5, or another league that is already kind of operating as a 5-on-5 league comes up, takes the players. This is already a league and a sports ecosystem that gravitates more towards the individual now than it ever has in terms of following stars over teams. And Unrivaled has already proven that there is a television appetite for this via a deal made with TNT and a valuation in 9 figures. This feels like, given what we've seen in terms of like the labor ebbs and flows in the United States in the last 5 years, this feels like somewhat of a major inflection point. 2020 with COVID, you started seeing this massive shakeup of worker power, people having options, having choices, and there was almost this very harsh response from the capital class in terms of work from home, in terms of pay, in terms of how job openings are created. And now the labor market is much more tilted 5 years later towards capital than it is towards labor, which is why I think that a highly publicized labor fight in which the opposite end of the capital is something resembling a worker co-op, and something where the worker has a vested equity interest in the labor that they are providing, feels like something that is kind of a big deal. Because these labor fights that we seem to have, they exist at a thing like Starbucks, right? But when celebrities are involved and athletes are involved, that's how you end up with, the NBA's 2011 work stoppage that, resulted in a major turn for labor, at least within the sports world, right? You saw it back in the 1930s with SAG-AFTRA, and how, the creation of that fundamentally altered Hollywood, but also came around at a time in the mid 1930s when labor protections had been so gutted that it created a new movement of how labor existed in this country. Do you think that on some level, it's not necessarily a threat to sports owners, but it has to be a little concerning, because it potentially can provide a framework for players in other leagues to decide, hey, a league that we run that has equity, that can still solicit PE and other financial support, can still exist, but we at least have some type of voting stake in the direction of the league as a whole. And then that can trickle down to the public, who can say, maybe this, gig economy job that I have, all of us are the people driving for Uber. Why don't we just make a worker co-op that supplants, a 1099 corporation the way that Uber is? do you think, as someone who is, much more ensconced in this stuff at the highest levels than I am, do you think that there is a framework for that to happen? Or is this more of just sort of a self-contained battle with very unique circumstances happening in the sports world?
Wow. Andrew, you were right. That was a very loaded question. Starting with coming up with a logical conclusion, right? Because you said it very simply. It's a logical conclusion. So first, let me take the PE part, because that's near and dear to my heart.
Mhm.
In the last CBA negotiations for the men, we were able to get it such that the players could invest in PE, that could invest in Ps. That's skin in the game. That's equity at its finest, right? That's generational wealth. That's what we want. That's what we were pushing for. That's what they were able to get accomplished. That's a logical conclusion. Should that be something that's being talked about here for the women, right? So that they can feel like they're part of it, that they can feel like they've earned something at the end of the day. I don't know about all of the negotiation and what's happening, but yes, that's a step certainly in the right direction. You also mentioned, like, is this a big deal? It is a big deal. It is an inflection point. And who would have thought that we all could have been on camera and done our work as well as we did during COVID and still been profitable as a nation, as a world, and continue to do things? It happened because they had the ability to reimagine what was possible when they were forced to do so. And I think here, that's precisely the point. They have to reimagine what this world could look like, in which women are feeling valued, feeling that they're being paid what they are worth, and feeling like they have some skin in the game. They're not asking to be paid as much as the men. They're asking that there's parity. So if you can look at a team in the NBA, being valued at $10 billion, and now you're looking at a women's team being valued at $250 million, it does not make sense that the average salary is $130,000. It is simple economics. At Secretariat, our economists could tell you all day that if I just put those numbers against each other, it does not make sense. It is pure basic economics. So it's not only just the perception that they're not being valued, it's also the reality of, from an economic standpoint, if you compare apples to apples, that it just doesn't make sense. So yes, it is time for us all to sort of step back, pause, decide how we want the future to be written and what side of history we want to be on, right? And so it may mean that we have to start again. It really may.
It's going to be a battle. I know you can't wait to see the result as much as I do, but the process of it is quite a fun one too. Tamika, before we go and let you go, we kind of do this with everyone, whether it's players, coaches, journalists, every guest we have. If there's anything that you are looking to kind of push out and promote, any events that you guys are doing, any place to find you, if you have anything like that, this is the time.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. So yes, here at Secretariat, really excited about the business of sports, whether it's on the pro sports side, obviously have tremendous experience in that area, but also in the world of colleges and universities, the NIL world, what athletic departments are doing, what presidents of universities are doing. All of that is a really big deal. I spoke on a panel yesterday about it being a jungle, and it really is a jungle. And it's about sort of how do you find those solutions? And here at Secretariat, with our economists, our engineers, we're able to help to make those things happen. So I'm really excited about it and excited about the future here at Secretariat. So thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to say that.
Of course, of course. And thank you, Tamika, for joining us. And that's all the time we got for Ball Up Top, a WBB podcast presented by No Cap Space WBB. I'm Andrew Hobner. She is the managing director of Secretariat and former exec director of the NBPA, Tamika Tremaglia. Tamika, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Andrew.